Hey, maybe they'll film the next season in Italy. Who knows? We'll have to see. Anthony, great reporting as always. Go to lawandcrime.com to learn a little bit more of the top trending stories of the day. But our focus right now is going to be on the Jessica Chambers case, the retrial of Quentin Tellis. And to help me talk about this, we have a brand new guest. I'm very happy to welcome her here to Law and Crime, criminal defense attorney and former district attorney, Lissette Fernandez. Lissette, great to have you here on Law and Crime.
Jesse, it's a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Now, you and I were talking before we came on. You handled a case eerily similar to Jessica Chambers. Can you talk about it a little bit?
Sure. I actually prosecuted a case where a man was burned alive for 98% of his body. It was caught on video. But the reason this really struck me when I was evaluating this case was, as a prosecutor, the first thing we wanted to determine was he survived. Mm-hmm. He died months later. I wanted to know, can he tell us a little bit about what happened? And,
right.
And as badly burned as he was, even though he was in the burn unit, he could still talk about, he recognized his family members. And so when I see the Jessica Chambers case...
I'm sorry, was he able to identify who did this to him?
Well, it was caught on camera. It was caught on video. So I always made it a point when I was a prosecutor to always immediately interview the victims or go to the crime scene. The reason this struck me was because the first thing I would have done if I'm prosecuting the Jessica Chambers case is, there's all these reports by law enforcement or first responders saying she made statements. Well, obviously by the time the prosecution got involved, she passed. But the first thing in line should have been, can we figure out, can we figure out if she was able to make these statements? And they didn't do that until the second trial.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that because that becomes a real big issue for the prosecution. In fact, that's why they brought on a speech pathologist to talk about whether or not Jessica Chambers could even mouth these words. But before we get there, let's start from the beginning. This is the prosecution's opening statement where they kind of describe where they're going to go in this case and talk about these first responders. Take a look. Okay, so this Eric or Derek utterance becomes a huge issue in this case. And you have to believe that's maybe why the first trial ended in a mistrial for Quentin Tellis. But Lissette, you and I had talked about this in the break. The jury is so critical in this case. And this trial could either live or die based upon the jury you pick, right?
Absolutely. We learn early on as prosecutors, as defense attorneys, what have you, if you pick the right jury, if you spent the right amount of time doing voir dire and getting to know your jury, the chances of you getting that conviction, provided that, or acquittal, whichever side you're on, provided that the evidence is there, is huge. And from what I read and I see about this case, it took the jury selection for a huge capital murder case took 1 day.
Right. 1
day. I don't think I've ever picked a jury in 1 day, ever. It takes days sometimes, and so that's very critical. How well equipped the prosecutors were in this case. This is a small town. There's 500 people here. I don't think they've ever seen a murder like this.
So funny you should say that. One of our chatters said, well, when these first responders came, why didn't investigators take pictures of suspects if it's such a small town? Maybe Eric's or Derek show pictures to Jessica, and maybe she was able to identify who did this. I mean, was that even a possibility?
She died really quickly thereafter, but assuming that law enforcement is trained properly, that would be something that, they seem to say that they're always investigating gangs right in this area. So you would think that they would have books with suspects where they would know Eric's or Derek's, but that wasn't even, I don't even think that was a thought in their mind.
It was just trying to save her life.
Exactly.
Right.
But, I would think that it would be something that first responders or law enforcement should think about. If she's still alive and she's speaking, let's try to, show her something.
It would have been a different scenario if she was alive for weeks.
Absolutely.
And then they could have shown her.
You would have hoped that they would have done that, but I can almost, based on what I've seen, I don't think they would have.
Yeah, there's something unsettling about the case in general, and we're going to talk more about it. Now, we're not going to tell you what the verdict is just yet. We have a lot more to cover in this case. This is just the beginning with some of the prosecution and defense's opening statements. But when we come back, we're going to talk more about the Jessica Chambers case, the retrial of Quentin Tellis. Stay tuned. Now, you may remember that Cole Haley testified in the first trial, and he was extremely emotional and distraught talking about what happened to Jessica Chambers. You see him now, and we're getting reports that he is just a shell of a man that he once was. This really had an impact on him. I'm back here with Lissette Fernandez. You think he's a good witness for the defense or the prosecution after looking at him?
He's definitely a good witness for the defense.
Even though he was called by the prosecution?
Even though he was called by the prosecution, yeah, because he sets for defense. He says, she told me her name. I mean, he shows how she clearly knew what she was talking about. He helps the defense bolster their claim that she said it was somebody else, and not only did she say, Eric, she was able to say her name. She was able to ask for a blanket. She was able to ask for different things that she needed to talk about her pain. That shows what the defense is saying. She was, able to speak and say what she needed to say.
In other words, she could say those words, so what shouldn't we believe Eric and Derek?
Exactly.
All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, let's listen a little bit more to other first responders. Multiple departments, different people, all hearing Eric or Derek. Now, I am back here with criminal defense attorney and former district attorney Lissette Fernandez. Lissette, you'll hear the prosecution say, hey, wait a minute, one person heard something, they coordinated their statements, maybe they thought they heard it, but you have different departments hearing the same thing. What do you make of these first responders' statements?
That's what happened. They are concise to exactly what her utterance was. Eric did it. There was, I believe, reviewing the case, there was 12 reports, 12 different, written down close in time when the incident happened. To me, this is strong evidence that 12 different people, first responders, heard her say, Eric did it.
Do you think it matters when they keep saying, hey, well, it was a chaotic situation, how do we know what she really said? But at the same time, they're questioning her. They're questioning them and saying, "Hey, you heard her say her name. You heard her say thirsty." Exactly.
She asked for, I think, a blanket. She asked for water. I mean, what I don't understand is the prosecution seems to want to use that to their you can't split the baby. Either she could speak and convey what she wanted, or she couldn't. You can't have it both ways. And calling all these witnesses to me only bolsters the defense side. That says it wasn't just someone who mistakenly overheard or thought she said. You have 12 different reports.
Let me ask you the $1 million.
That corroborate.
Let me ask you the $1 million question here. Do you have a sense that the investigators here were put under pressure? They narrowed their focus on Quentin Tellis and just tried to make the evidence work for them without doing a thorough investigation?
Absolutely. I believe they did. They did a 14-month-long investigation, so they say, because that's when they end up arresting Quentin. But I think there came a point where the focus was, this is who she was last with. This is who. And so, yes, I believe that there is sometimes agencies, prosecutors can become a little bit overzealous and become a little clouded, because it could have just as easily been, there were so many men in her life, right? Could have just as easily been any of them. They were questioned just like Quentin. They gave polygraphs. They gave alibis, but they seemed to focus on his and not them. I mean,
we have one of our chatters who said, why didn't they look more at Jerry, the guy who found the keys? Because him and his last name, they almost could sound. I mean, Jerry could almost sound like you're trying to say Eric or Derek in a way.
Especially because his last name, I think, starts with...
Right. So the question is, and when we get back, I want to ask you, and I've asked this about from every guest, what does it mean to rule a suspect out in an investigation? And it means so much in this case, because we hear about other Erics and other Dereks who were ruled out. I'm talking about Derek Holmes, Eric Hill, and other individuals. What does it mean? So you process that? You think about that? When we come back, we're going to talk about it. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime. There's a lot more to discuss. So just ignore the expert. Okay, I'm back here with Lissette Fernandez. Ignore the expert. The expert that was never called in the first case. So why do you think the prosecution brought this witness out the second time?
Because this is their only saving grace. They know they don't have a strong case. If it was going to be brought in, it should have been brought in initially. All they really, I mean, this is what they have. They need someone to come in and now bolster their position that she couldn't have actually said, Derek did it. But the reality is, just like they can get an expert that says that, the other side can get an expert that says that. That says the opposite.
So what they're basically saying, though, here is, hey, ignore her. Because how do we ignore what the first responders heard?
Exactly.
Is that a fair statement?
Of course it is. Well, what she's saying is, I don't think she's saying ignore her. I think she's saying weigh it appropriately and accordingly. Because defense counsel says first responders were there. They documented it. They saw her. They wrote it close in time of when she made the statement versus an expert that's coming in almost 4 years later who wasn't there, who didn't see anything, who's just going to talk about what one could arguably say, science. So I don't think she's saying completely ignore her because she is an expert and she is being brought forth as evidence, her testimony. But what I think the defense attorney is saying is give it the proper weight, right?
Yeah.
What was recorded immediately close in time, and you've got several statements, not just one.
Not an easy thing for the jury to consider,
No.
but let's listen a little bit to this speech pathologist, Dr. Carolyn Higdon, who again wasn't called in the first trial, but was definitely called in the second one. Well, I'm not going to waste any time. I just want to get your opinion right now, Lissette. What do you think about her testimony?
I don't think it has a leg to stand on. I mean, she is saying that it is usually they say generally, in my expert opinion, this couldn't have happened. She's stern and saying this didn't happen, but we know that she was able to make other statements, and so it's completely biased. It's biased towards the prosecution so that they can make their case. I don't know how she can. She wasn't there. I don't know how she can say it's completely impossible that Jessica was able to make any statements.
Is that a fair analysis that she would have to be there to really make an analysis? Because we have so many experts who come on and well, I've interviewed the defendant, I've interviewed the victim, I did an autopsy, I was right there. Her whole job is to listen, right?
Exactly.
But then again, maybe she was able to tell something based upon the damage to the vocal cords.
Well, she's obviously saying she reviewed it based on pictures and based on reviewing the case file and everything else. But what I'm saying is she is making a very strong assertion. And usually when experts testify, they say, in my opinion, this couldn't have happened, but there's always that window of that possibility.
Right.
And she's frankly, clearly saying it's impossible. And I have a problem with that.
Why do you think she's saying that?
Because she's the prosecution's witness.
You believe that? There's a sense of bias.
There's definitely a bias. Absolutely. In my opinion.
So cynical.
In my opinion. I just, the way I see the way this case is being pitched the second time around, it's really how do we cover wherever we, not even messed up before, but whatever we didn't, how do we make this case stick?
And that Eric and Derek issue, you believe, is really what tore those juries, split them in the first trial.
Absolutely.
So, in other words, did this witness work out well for them in the prosecution at the end of the day?
I think this witness still does not help them overcome 12 people saying she said Eric.
Well, we are going to have to see, because we're not letting you know what the verdict is. And for everybody who doesn't know, don't look it up. Just follow us here on Law and Crime. We're going to let you know what it is, but we want to analyze this case in its entirety. And when we come back, there's going to be a bigger discussion on Jessica Chambers and including her injuries. We'll be right back, right after this. Great reporting, Anthony. Go to lawandcrime.com to learn a little bit more of the top trending stories of the day. We're going to switch gears and talk about Jessica Chambers, but before we do, I want to bring back in Lissette Fernandez. Lissette, what we're about to see is the testimony from the forensic pathologist, and we're not going to show the images of the injuries sustained by Jessica Chambers, but what is the value for the jury to see these injuries? Why does that help them determine whether or not Quentin Tellis did this?
It really doesn't. I mean, obviously, it helps. I guess you could argue that it helps kind of play on their emotions. But I think there's no doubt, right, that she died and she was burned alive. The images are quite disturbing, as you know. But it still doesn't connect. Doesn't connect it to anybody. Just connects to the fact that she was burned alive.
So is it necessary to show these photos?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, what we have to do, because as the prosecution has to actually present their case that Jessica Chambers ultimately died and succumbed to these wounds. We heard the testimony from Dr. Erin Barnhart, who is the forensic pathologist, and she is about to describe in detail what happened to Jessica Chambers. So I warn our viewers right now, this may be tough to listen to. Okay, some interesting questioning there, Lissette. Why were they asked about the menstrual cycle of this young girl?
I think the relevance there is the fact that Quentin, when he was asked questions about being with Jessica that day earlier on, he did say that he wanted to have intercourse with her, but she had said no because she was having her cycle.
Wow. I mean, we're trying to find a motive here about why he would have done this. And maybe we will never know what really a motive like this could be, but we'll talk more about it in a second. Let's continue on with Dr. Erin Barnhart, this forensic pathologist, and this is the part where the defense cross-examines her on the issue of a traumatic injury to Jessica's mouth or tongue. So let's go to that right now. Okay, I'm sitting on the jury here, Lissette. I hear a speech pathologist say she suffered injuries, couldn't say a word that would, couldn't form any sentences. Now I'm trying to hear that there maybe weren't injuries that she sustained. What am I supposed to make of this if I'm sitting on the jury?
That's the point. How can a jury actually rule either way? The evidence is the prosecution's own witnesses are contradicting the evidence. And this doctor is saying, her lungs were perfectly fine, her tongue was fine, and the other witness is saying impossible.
We got a question from one of our chatters that said maybe the prosecution made a mistake by first bringing these first responders on and bringing out the question of Eric or Derek. Maybe not even introduce it because maybe she was just trying to say a different word like air or something else. Was it a mistake for the prosecution to try to go underneath the defense's case, and start that conversation about the Eric or Derek issue?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's a mistake. It's actual evidence, so the prosecution has a duty to disclose the evidence that they do have. So I just think that the mistake might have been maybe in the strategy of how they, downplayed it. I think that they tried to downplay it, but instead they pretty much made it the highlight, and it helps the defense. I think strategically there should have been a better way to address it.
Okay, now I have to ask you this question, okay?
Yes.
I've asked every guest we've had, what does it mean to rule a suspect out? Because they're talking about a real investigation about other Erics and Dereks. They have alibis. How do we believe that? What does that mean to rule someone out categorically?
Well, you would hope that, if there's a DNA evidence, that really helps, right? You do a swab, you test to see if there was DNA in the person, and you could determine whether or not that would really help. In this case, though, what they did was they interviewed, I think, 140 suspects, and including Derek's and Eric's, and they were given polygraphs. They were asked to give alibis, and they seem to have selectively used their own discretion as to who they believed and who they didn't, because there's Eric Hill,
Derek Holmes.
Right, Eric Hill, who had also taken a polygraph and given alibis, and they quickly said, okay, he passed the polygraph, we believe his alibis, and the same thing was with Quentin, right? But then they focused on Quentin. So unfortunately, it sounds like they used whatever they believed was their own discretion to determine who they believe was telling the truth, because a polygraph gave the same results for Quentin and for Eric, but they let Eric go quite easily. They believed all his alibis, which were family members that said he was here, he was rubbing mom's feet.
Isn't that troubling?
And then it is very troubling, and then there's Quentin's family members who are also say, he gave alibis that were just as weak as Eric's, but they focused on him.
And when we get back,
that's puzzling.
It is puzzling, and it sounds a little disturbing at the same point. But when we get back, we're going to focus more on the evidence against Quentin Tellis, because he is not as innocent as we would have to believe in terms of what he told investigators. So we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Okay, so we have talked about there being issues in this investigation, and maybe not even more so than the keys, right, Lissette? So we're going to play the testimony of Officer Tyler Mills, and what we are going to see is the way these keys were handled. there are serious issues here, and also how they were taken back and then put back into the crime scene where they were ultimately photographed. This is so troubling. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
absolutely.
This shouldn't happen.
No, it shouldn't. There is a proper vouchering procedure. There is a chain of custody, and all of those were completely botched and violated. So those keys should mean nothing as a piece of evidence. But even more disturbing is that the officer did this, and that just shows how much they lacked knowledge of how to properly investigate this case, which is a big case.
Yeah, I mean, these keys were taken by Jerry King, who found them, took them back home. Who knows the contamination that was on there? So if a jury hears that there's an error in one point of the investigation, do they think the whole investigation's botched?
I mean, that's part of the problem, right? I mean, the keys are part of the crime scene. So now the crime scene is practically tainted.
Right.
You have taken a piece of evidence from the crime scene. That's a problem. And, all you need is reasonable doubt.
That's all you need. That's all you need. Let's play some of the testimony from Officer Tyler Mills, who handled these keys, and you can hear some of these questions being addressed. Okay, Lissette. All right. The keys were played with a toddler. They were taken away from the crime scene. They're brought back to the crime scene, dropped in an approximate location. Maybe this is where they were. They're photographed. This guy had no problem with this, and let's not even forget this. This is not his specialty. He was part of the narcotics division, and he had never handled evidence or collected evidence in a homicide investigation before. What's going on?
It doesn't matter whether you're a law enforcement. So vouchering is vouchering. Chain of command is the same. It doesn't matter that's not an excuse. I'm a narcotics officer. I've never done a homicide. They should. Any crime scene has to be safeguarded, and there's protocols and procedures, and that's police officer 101.
Right.
So it's scary.
It is scary. Now, yes, we're talking so much about the investigation, how it may have been tainted, but there is a lot of evidence against Quentin Tellis.
Yes.
So, in your opinion, what are the strongest pieces of evidence against him?
His statement, let's start off with the cell phone towers, the data that shows that they were together, and he corroborates it, right, saying I was with her. I think that's strong evidence, but it's not enough.
What about when he misled investigators?
Misleading investigators, but again, you can't just use his statements. You need to have more than his statements. So the cell phone data plus his statements helps.
And the fact that he was maybe the last person to be with her before this attack occurred, it seems a little suggestive.
Right, and again, by his own admission and corroborated with the data, the cell phone data.
Okay, well, we are not going to be talking about Jessica Chambers when we come back, because we are going to be live in the Tammy Moore case in South Carolina. That's right, we'll have a live feed, so stay tuned here on Law&Crime. All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to have to take a quick break on our end, but I'm glad that we're in this case because it is bizarre. I'm here with Lissette Fernandez to talk more about it. This is a weird one, right? I mean, this is strange. What do you make of it so far?
Bizarre is a good word to use. Disturbing in that the way the body was disposed, or what's assumed to be disposed. But, it's typical love triangle.
This happens.
This happens, and that's the scary part.
But a wife helping the husband to get rid of his lover.
Yeah.
You've heard of this before?
Well, no. I mean, we hear it in movies sometimes. The reality is this could be the making of a good Lifetime movie, right?
I really wish it wasn't. I really wish this wasn't. I really wish this was just a movie because it's so sad.
It's unfortunate.
A 20-year-old girl that we don't know what happened to her. She's been missing for 5 years. Yeah. It's pretty incredible. So we're going to have to see which way it goes. But Lissette, I'm happy you're here to break down this case with us. And we'll have to take a quick break. But before we do you think he's going to take the stand against his wife?
More likely than not, for two reasons. One, Fifth Amendment, if he's also a target, and two, there's marital privilege.
Meaning he can't testify against her?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's benefits to being married, I guess, in this case.
Exactly.
All right, here's what we're going to do. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be live in that South Carolina courtroom. So stay tuned here on Law&Crime. Okay, this is getting even more strange. I want to talk about this case with Lissette right now. What we've learned is that, yes, if there's this affair that went on between Sydney and Heather, Tammy was okay with it. Apparently, they may have had an open marriage. We learned a little bit about this yesterday in court. How does that affect the dynamics of this case?
Makes them, well, if they had an open marriage, then it just fortifies the fact that, you know, she's going to do whatever she needs to do to help him and keep that open marriage.
But the flip side is if she was angry and wanted to get rid of, you know, this young woman, it made more sense. But it's now, what are we dealing with? What kind of love triangle is this?
It's bizarre. It's bizarre, but at the same token, if she was willing to have an open marriage with him, then they both may have been willing to do whatever it takes to keep that open relationship going.
Oof, this is getting a torrid love affair, if you're asking me.
Yeah.
We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. All right, everybody. So we're going to have to take a quick break. But before we do, I want to ask Lissette a really important question about this. How difficult is it to prosecute a kidnapping case when you don't have the body?
Very difficult. I mean, it's clearly that's going to be a strictly circumstantial case, and proving sufficient evidence to a jury that this person isn't, you know, in Brazil somewhere is going to be very difficult.
I mean, 5 years, no one knows anything where she is, no trace of her. They had murder charges, but they dropped them because there was no body. So what makes them think that they can get kidnapping?
Well, that should tell you also the fact that it went from murder to kidnapping. Let's not forget, you know, what happens when the prosecution overcharges. We saw that in the Casey Anthony case. But
if they wanted to charge them with something, they think that they're responsible for her disappearance. What else could they charge them with?
I see what you're saying, but again, thinking someone's responsible is one thing, having the evidence to prove it is another.
Right. Well,
and our law requires that we have that evidence.
And maybe if they can show enough of a connection, enough of this weird triangle, and maybe that she was pregnant with his baby.
That would be excellent evidence.
Yeah, the phone records seem to be really strong here, you know, and exactly what we're talking about, and it should be noted, we'll talk about a little bit more about them yesterday when we get back, but there's an expert who took the stand that really tracked her cell phone and where her movements were in relation to the Moores. We'll talk about that right after this break. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime. All right, I'm back here with Lissette Fernandez. What are we learning right now from the way these cell phone records are being analyzed?
Well, we're learning something that's very important. Cell phone records are excellent pieces of evidence. However, with today's modern technology, it's important to note that when apps are being used to make text messages or calls, there's a problem tracking the actual number that's being dialed.
Right, yeah, and especially if we're trying to see if Sydney blocked his number. Well,
exactly.
Not Sydney blocked his number, but Sydney called from a payphone, so it wouldn't appear on Heather's phone records. There's obviously suspicious behavior here from what we're seeing, and that's what's being led to believe. But we're going to talk a little bit more about the weird relationship between Tammy and Sydney a little bit later on. So let's go live.
Numerous calls or calls that went inbound and went routed, which would be your voicemail. Or it's having a voicemail.
Okay. And Your Honor, I think that's a mischaracterization of my question. The question was that the caller, the outgoing call, hung up their phone, not if the person receiving the device receiving the call sent the outgoing call to
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we're going to take a quick break, but before we do, Lissette, we have learned some interesting details about the relationship between Tammy and Sydney. Can you speak a little bit more about it?
Yes. Well, we've learned that they may have had an open relationship. I don't know if how true it is. It could be part of their defense. But more interestingly is the fact that Heather might have been pregnant, and that gives them the motive to get rid of her.
You know, we're learning also how weird their relationship is. Apparently, they had a weird fascination with Disney.
Yes.
Apparently, when Tammy found out maybe about the affair or the pregnancy, she may have handcuffed him to the bed. This is very strange for a common juror to hear.
Yes, we're dealing with a bizarre couple, for lack of a better phrase. But, you know, the jury is going to have to look past that, because if there was a victim, there was another person, and you know, but it's difficult for juries not to get fascinated, right, with these interesting characters.
But the cell phone evidence seems to be pretty strong here. I mean, if you're saying that she had made a call to him at 3:15 in the morning, then he made a phone call to her at some point, you know, on this payphone, and then the last time that we can track is that about a half hour after this 3:15 call, her phone was in the vicinity of a boat landing where the Moores allegedly lured her away, and then 4 more calls were made from her phone to Sydney Moore. It's placing her in connection with these people right before she disappeared.
Absolutely, and that's why I believe they're spending so much time right now with the phone records, because that seems to be their strongest piece of evidence.
Especially when you don't have a body.
Especially when you don't have a body, and I think it also, the phone calls corroborate with the time that he's caught on video approaching a payphone
At the gas station.
At the gas station, so that is huge to corroborate those records.
Is there a way that you can get a conviction even without a body but with strong cell phone evidence?
If you can get a conviction with circumstantial evidence, as long as the jury believes it and accepts it.
Okay, well, we'll have to see. This is the Tammy Moore case out of South Carolina. We will take a quick break, but when we come back, we will be live, and there is plenty more to talk about. Welcome back, everybody. We are continuing our discussion with the Tammy Moore case. They are currently in their morning break. We were live there earlier today, and we'll be back live there after their morning break. But there's a lot to discuss. So before we play some of the testimony that you may have missed this morning, I want to bring back my very special guest, criminal defense attorney and former district attorney, Lissette Fernandez, to help break down some of the things that we've been talking about with this case. Now, Sydney Moore, the husband of Tammy Moore, who was allegedly having an affair with Heather, the victim here, his first trial for kidnapping charges ended in a mistrial, but he was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison for obstruction of justice for basically stalling this investigation. So my question to you first is, we believe he's going to be retried. How difficult is it to get a successful second trial?
It's very difficult. We always learn early on as trial lawyers, you win your case at the trial level the first time around. It is absolutely difficult. If you didn't have the evidence then, you know, are you going to have it the second time around? So it's very difficult, and it can turn out to be a waste of taxpayers' money. It's one of the most difficult things you face. You know, winning that trying that case again and getting a conviction. It's an uphill battle. It's very rare.
Absolutely.
You know, I had an experience with that as a very young prosecutor. You know, I inherited a case that was a police shooting with trafficking of drugs and what have you, and there was a time where there was a big rift between the community and the police, so it was very difficult to win the case.
Right.
I took it after there was two hung juries, and not to pat my own back, but what I learned from my mentor at the time was it's all in the jury. Yeah. You have the evidence. We're losing because there's a rift between the community and the police. And I spent over a week picking that jury and really doing voir dire. And we were successful, which was completely unheard of. This was the third time around we were trying this case, but I believe we were successful was for the voir dire, the time that was put into it, selecting those jurors, connecting with them, and getting them to overcome that rift that existed with the community and the police.
It's interesting you say that, because sometimes we cover cases here that keep ending in mistrials, and we wonder if this is just a case that cannot be decided one way or another, but maybe it really is the people that are selected for that jury. So who knows? And we keep talking about that with the Jessica Chambers case. So we'll see what happens ultimately to Sydney Moore too. But before we do that, let's play some testimony from today. In particular, I want to start now with Officer Jonathan Martin, who is from the police department, and going over the cell phone records of Heather Elvis and how she was communicating with her lover, Sydney Moore, and also how Tammy Moore is connected to these cell phone records as well. So let's listen to some testimony from earlier today.
Evidence.
Okay, so that was an interesting tidbit. He said, I've never actually served out a search warrant for a payphone. And that's, I guess, a little bit of a strange thing here. I'm back here with Lissette Fernandez. Oh, you know what? That's okay. Lissette, it's okay. I know we're having some technical issues with the IFB there, but that's okay. So my question to you is anybody that uses a payphone in today's day and age, they're trying to hide something?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say they're trying to hide something, but it's bizarre, right? Who uses a payphone in this day and age? However, you have to keep in mind, though, this couple, they're not your average Joes, your average people. But it's interesting. Why is a payphone being used? I mean, I didn't even know if they're working, most of them.
Right.
So it shows me that there was time and effort taken into making that consideration to use that phone.
Because he didn't want his number to appear on
exactly.
the phone. Now, why would that be? So if we're saying, okay, let's make this, there's video of him going into a Walmart and buying a pregnancy test.
And a cigar.
And a cigar. What does that tell you that, and again, Tammy Moore is now saying, well, I knew I knew they were having an affair. We had an open relationship. So what are we supposed to believe? That if she knew this was happening and he was having a baby, why would they try to get rid of her? I mean, it makes more sense. I'm not sure which way we should go with this narrative here. I guess I'm confused.
Well, if they did have this open relationship and at the end, and he allows her to handcuff him to the bed, as we've heard, right? Then that shows us that she's the one in power and she calls the shots. So at the end of the day, she might have given him the ultimatum: we either get rid of our problem, or I walk, or maybe she threatened him. We don't know. But it sounds to me like the one controlling the situation is Tammy.
That's really and we're showing like B-roll footage right now of her, and this is a really strange affair for the Moores, including the fact that Sydney Moore, and that's a live feed right there. That's a live feed of the courtroom. This is happening right now. But Sydney Moore, his first trial for kidnapping, that was a mistrial. Do you think that it might be the same case here? Because, as you said, proving these kidnapping cases without a body is really tough.
Yes. However, they do have the good evidence on the cell phone that we spoke about earlier, the cell phone records and the video corroborating the time the calls were being made where Sydney's approaching the cell phone. I'm not saying that's enough evidence, but it's still an uphill battle to prove a kidnapping.
Okay, let's learn a little bit more from the cell phone records from Officer Jonathan Martin from the police department in this area, who talked about it earlier today. So in case you missed it, this is some really important testimony about the communications leading up to Heather Elvis's disappearance. Okay, so we know that there is a constant communication between Heather, the victim here, and Sydney Moore, her lover, the husband of the defendant, Tammy Moore here, and we're understanding this connection, this communication leading up to her ultimate disappearance back in 2013. Her truck that she was driving was last seen in the location where she ultimately disappeared. And Lissette, I have to ask, the likelihood that we will ever find her or her remains, I'm sure you've seen a lot of these cases before. How likely is it?
I'd say slim to none. I know there are allegations that they believe the body was thrown in the swamps where the crocodiles could obviously eat it and destroy it. So if that were true, then yeah, we'll never know. But the odds are very slim to none. It's been 5 years, correct?
Right. So we're talking about cell phones, when they're activated, when messages are sent. My question to you is, how do we know who used a phone, right? Isn't it so possible that whoever did something to her was the one using her phone at certain points?
Absolutely, and we don't know for sure. I mean, it's a possibility, but again, the hurdle the prosecution has is proving that that phone was with her, that she was, with connecting the person to the phone.
Right.
That's a big hurdle.
I wonder in today's day and age, I mean, this is talking about 2013, if something would happen today where people have, the only way they can operate their phone is through their finger, or, I'm sure there's facial recognition now. I don't know what the kids are doing on the apps, but I'm saying that might be a way now to track people later on.
Absolutely. But in 2013, we didn't have that.
Yeah, we're talking about at 3:40 a.m., Elvis's phone was tracked at a tower where she also made 4 calls to Sydney Moore's number, and there were no more phone calls by Elvis after that time. So it gives you at least a timeline of the activity of her phone and when she may have been using it. But we don't know what happened to her, and it has been 5 years. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Back, everybody. We have a live feed in the Tammy Moore case out of South Carolina, the woman who is on trial for kidnapping and conspiring to kidnap with her husband, Sydney Moore, Heather Elvis, a 20-year-old hostess that disappeared back in 2013, never to be heard from or seen from again. Now, one of the great things I love to do here is I love to take my guest, who's Lissette here, and I'm going to read you some messages, and I didn't speak to you about these beforehand, so I just want your immediate reaction. One of the messages, the tweet from Tammy says, "One of these days, I will drag that man into the mop closet and have my way with him. Lord have mercy." I'm assuming she's talking about Sydney Moore. Then she once tweeted, "Once upon a time, an angel and devil fell in love. It did not end well." What do you make of these tweets?
Well, earlier I mentioned that I thought she was the brains behind this operation. If in fact they killed her, this just fortifies what I believe. She runs the show. She controls. And she controls Sydney. And I believe that when she found out what was going on, there was no choices. It was, especially when they believed that a child was in a possibility.
Right. So, I mean, what she seems to be saying now is, I knew about the affair. We had an open relationship, but we learned from our friend yesterday that she never heard anything about an open relationship between the two of them. So what's going on here?
What's going on here, I believe,
she's making it up?
She's making it up. But I still think she's the one that controls the situation.
I mean, there's also allegations that she handcuffed him to the bed so he wouldn't leave at night.
He's much bigger and burlier than her, so the fact that he allowed her to do that once again, to me, shows that she still controls.
Do you see cases where couples engage in a criminal act together like this?
They're not as common, you know, on a daily basis, I would say. No, I think this one particularly is a quite interesting love triangle.
So do you think during the course of this case we're going to learn more about their relationship?
Absolutely. You have to. That's the only way the jury could understand the case and the relation. By displaying the relationship, the jury needs to understand it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, I think we have a feed back in the courtroom, so let's go live into South Carolina. Okay, so we're going to take a quick break. Nothing too much is happening right now, more background information, but we'll jump back into that courtroom after the next break. I want to take my final moments, though, with Lissette Fernandez, who was so kind to stay for all morning and talk about this case. So I'm going to ask you, what does the defense need to do here for Miss Tammy Moore in order to secure an acquittal?
They basically have to hang their hat on the fact that there's nobody. You know, there's nobody. There's phone records are good, but you still can't prove that those phones were attached to the person at the time. Somebody else could have had them. They have to plant the reasonable doubt, and the fact that all the little circumstantial evidence that the prosecution may have does not connect.
What kind of witnesses do they call? Talk about their relationship, anything like that?
The defense? Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. They would call. If I were to call witnesses, I'd call witnesses to show that, you know, they were a happy couple, a tight couple. Anything to show, to give them more, I guess, credibility in the eyes of the jury.
Do they downplay that an affair happened? Maybe some other connection that he has?
At this point, I think accepting the affair happened is probably okay, because people have affairs. That doesn't mean they kill the adulterer partner.
I know. That's what makes this case so unique. Lissette, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Can't wait to have you back on.
Thank you.
Marnie Jo Snyder's next, and Vincent Hill is hosting next. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime.